right, on today's episode of the Anime Village podcast, I welcome on a very, very special guest. He's Tim Eldred. He's an animation director. You might have seen some of Tim's work as he's worked with the Batman animation, Teen Titans, Futurama, Spider-Man animation series, Samurai Rabbit, and a lot of DC and Marvel animation. So this is super exciting to have you on the show. Tim, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for joining.
Greetings, anime villagers of Earth, where I am also from.
Well, we're happy to have you on. It's super exciting. This is really cool. I was just talking to you a little bit off air about how I've watched a couple shows that you've done, like Jackie Chan Adventures, Teen Titans I've watched too, and this is really cool. But I want to know, how long have you been a fan of comic books, and where did all that passion start from?
I can't remember precisely when I read my first comic book, but I do know that they were still 20 cents at the time,
Oh,
which would make it early 70s, like 73, 74. And I'm reasonably certain my first comic book was based on Warner Brothers cartoons, Bugs Bunny and that.
yeah.
But I do remember also getting a Superman comic around that time and a Spider-Man comic around that time. So I had, the two of them side by side and just a single issue of each one. And Spider-Man far and away had more to say to me as a kid than Superman.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. And so that kind of launched me on an early Marvel track.
Yeah.
So by the late 70s, I was reading only Marvel comics, and that continued into the 80s. Um, when I then expanded into other publishers' works, because it was a little easier, by the mid 80s to find independent comics. And I was also getting interested in British comics and Japanese comics around that time.
Oh, wow.
And so um, it was sort of an interesting arc where Marvel peaked like around 1980 and then started to fall for me when we got toward the mid 80s, and they finally lost me when they published the first Secret Wars series.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How come?
Do you remember that one? Did you ever get to see it?
I did not get to see it, but my buddy has like the Secret Wars comics and stuff, so I know of
Uh-huh.
them.
Yeah, that was the first Marvel comic that I objectively looked at and said, this is junk. This is just junk food. It's not a story that's meant to convey a message or an emotion or a feeling. It's just, you know, uh, a fight fest. It
Right.
was the first big crossover where all the major characters went on a long journey together. And the fact that they could pull them out of their regular comics and then still have their regular comics continue, it was sort of a red flag for me. It's like, if you're trying to tell a story that's really important, wouldn't you then put all your attention on Secret Wars
Yeah.
and not make it something that could be easily dismissed? And so it sort of educated me on the marketing of comics and the way they were packaged up as a commodity. And that was a big turnoff, because at the same time, I was starting to read 2000 AD, which is a British comic, a weekly, that was exactly on the opposite end of that spectrum,
Yeah.
where story was king, and that stuff was great. And then, I couldn't really read Japanese comics, but I was already getting into anime, and I could certainly appreciate the craftsmanship of it and the fact that they were so much more about storytelling than what I was seeing from Marvel. And so I sort of look at that as an evolution period where my tastes were expanding and the availability was expanding too. It was getting a little bit easier to get independent and foreign stuff. Um, and I'm really glad it happened at that time, because it gave me a big taste of what else could be done in
Y-
comics. Um, but right from the beginning, just to take you back to the early 70s, I was already drawing, as soon as I could hold a pencil. And comic books were obviously something that people drew. And so it gave me an idea. Maybe I could make comics of my own,
Yeah.
because you can do a certain amount of, or you can convey a certain amount of information just with a still drawing. But if you put a whole strip of drawings next to each other, you can convey an event, a sequence. And
Yep.
then you start thinking more and more about what that represents and the fact that you can follow a character through a series of events, and you can find, establish a starting point and an end point, and then figure out what happens between. And then it becomes a whole exercise in creative storytelling. And that just made sense to me right from the beginning. And so I've been making my own comics ever since then.
That's awesome. So I know you have your own book, which is Grease Monkey. But like what
Yeah.
other comics that you created, like what are the other ones that you've created? Are they out? Can people buy them?
I haven't done any new comics in a long time in terms of paper.
Yep.
Um, I first got into the professional comics world in 1988, and my very first title was called Mecha, and it was published by Dark Horse.
Cool.
And it was a sequel to their series. They debuted a series called Mecha right at the time when anime was really taking off, and
Yeah.
so um, they grabbed a lot of eyeballs with that. Even though it wasn't Japanese and there were no Japanese people involved in it, it wasn't an adaptation of anything. It was original, but it was one of the first times an American publisher jumped into that pool, and the sales were tremendous.
Oh.
So they ran that over, I think, 6 or 8 issues, something like that, and it was starting to flag because the artist was getting behind, and it was slowing down. They lost their momentum, and then they moved it over into an anthology title called Mayhem. And by that time, I was already creating my own comics works that I pitched to Dark Horse, and an editor said, "Well, I can't really do your thing, but come on over here and work on my thing." So he just essentially gave me Mecha
Oh wow.
as a writer in that anthology title, and I picked up the story where it left off in the first series, and that became my first professional gig.
Huh. That's awesome. That's so cool. I like
Uh-huh.
where is like how long did you work on Mecha? Can we still like is it still available to
It
get?
was about I think 6 or 8 months, and this is where I need to tell you about my website,
Yeah.
because just about everything I've worked on is now out of print, and it's either really hard to find or impossible to find. And so, since I've got all this stuff still sitting in my archive, I decided about 3 years ago, well, I'm just going to start putting it on a website. And so I started up timeldred.com, and it's got multiple different channels you can look in to see my work. And one of those is a comic book channel where I'm just taking everything I've ever worked on in comics format and putting it online page by page.
Wow.
And so, and there are hundreds of individual issues from 1988 forward to when I transitioned over to TV animation about 10 years later. So Mecha is there, everything I ever did for Mecha. And I'm taking it chronologically. So if you want to follow my career from the beginning, you can do it online at that website.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. That's awesome. I saw your website. I didn't see the comic book section of it. But that's awesome. I'm excited. Now I gotta look and now I gotta read those because that's so
Mhm.
cool. Yeah, that's great. I like that you did it chronologically too.
Yep. And then there are other channels. There's one for all the TV shows I've worked on. There's one for various game projects that I illustrated, and other odds and ends. But the one that I think is the most fun is comics I did before I went pro, and that goes all the way back to when I was 12 years old in 1977.
Really?
Yep.
What were
Um,
they about? What were they called?
Star Wars mainly.
Star Wars?
I did a lot of Star Wars comics.
Did you really?
Because yeah,
Sure.
because Star Wars was the thing that really activated me. That was, I mean, comics showed me something I could do, but Star Wars really activated me as a storyteller.
Yeah.
There's a whole generation of people that it affected that way, who it just it reached down into our hearts and squeezed and said, this is what you can do. If you work really hard, you can tell a story like this. And I said, okay, sign me up. And so Star Wars kind of became my early playground.
That's awesome.
And I made my own Star Wars comics because at the time there was very little to continue that experience. You know, it
Yeah.
filled us up with so much energy. We just wanted it to keep going and going and going. But in the early years, it didn't have anything like the merchandising that you can get today.
Right.
I mean, if you want to see more Star Wars stories today, you don't have to go very far. Back then, you had to come up with them yourself
Yeah.
because we had Marvel comics that came out once a month. They weren't really that good, but they said Star Wars on them, so that kind of made them official. Occasionally, there was a novel, but again, nothing like what there is now.
Yeah.
And so um, I'm really grateful to have been part of that generation because it inspired us to, and it sort of forced us to come up with our own stuff. And that's how I was able to exercise my creative muscles. And if not for that, you know, if it was a different generation of Star Wars where all those spin-offs were freely available,
Yeah.
I might not never have been motivated to do any of that.
That's
And
a good point.
so, yeah, I'm really grateful that for that timing. And so, if you go to the website again and look in the kids comic channel, you'll see all the stuff I did back then. Um, and that got a nice boost in 1981 when I discovered that there was this whole network of science fiction fanzines. If you went to sci-fi conventions, um, there were fanzine publishers all over the place. And for me, that was like a dream come true. You know, not only could I write and draw my own Star Wars comics, I had a place to go to publish them and share them with the world. And, you know, these things were super cheap and they had very low circulation, maybe just a couple hundred copies of each one. Um, but it was a way to take that next step up.
Yeah.
And instead of just making comics for myself, I could now make them for other people. And so when you sort of move yourself onto that platform, you begin to think differently. You have to then consider, you know, how is another person going to absorb this? And what information do they need to know step by step by step to get to the climax of a story? And so it was another playground and it was another opportunity to learn my craft. Um, and I did that for several years and finally got up to the point where I was ready to start pitching myself to professional comic book publishers. And the first bite came from Dark Horse in 1988.
Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Did like anyone give you feedback on off those like fan like off your own comic books of the Star Wars that you created? Like did anyone give you feedback how they liked them,
sure.
enjoyed them?
Yeah. It was interesting to put something in a fanzine, and you know, that was just me hooking up with an editor at a convention and saying,
Yeah.
"Hey, I draw comics," which was in itself very unusual because most of what they published was fan fiction, you know, text with occasional illustrations. But you know, little 17-year-old Tim comes along and says, "Hey, I draw comic books. You want to put a comic book in your fanzine?" And they'd say, "Sure, that'd be great." And so I earned a little extra attention that way just by being the standout in the crowd. And um, typically it would come out in one issue, and then there would be reader letters in the next issue, just like in a comic book. And the feedback was all over the map. Some people said, I don't know why you're doing a comic book. This isn't really what I'm looking for. Others would say, this is really cool. Let's see some more. Um, Other people would say, well, it needs some polish. It's obviously rough. And it was. They were right, because I was only 17.
Yeah.
Uh, but it was another way to make a connection and see that people were actually absorbing my stuff. And it was, a huge boost.
That's
Um, as somebody who was just working alone for years and years, it was like finally being connected up to the world.
Yeah, that's that's awesome. I mean, to be at 17 and to be as proactive too, to ask and not be afraid to ask to like, hey, do you want to publish this like I draw comics, would you like to publish it? I think that's also like
Mhm.
shows the ambition that you had too at a young age. I mean, like you said, Star Wars inspired you to start drawing and make your own comics, and then all of a sudden now you're asking someone at 17, which a lot of 17-year-old kids I don't think they would do today. I think they'd be too nervous to see what would happen, but it shows the how proactive you are and how ambitious you are.
Well, I've been on the other end of that exchange too.
Yeah,
When I finally started working on staff for a comic publisher, and that was Malibu Comics. And that started up in 89 and went all the way up to, I think, 94. They would occasionally take me along to comic book conventions, and I would be their portfolio guy.
yeah.
So I would sit down at a review table, and kids would come up to me with their work,
Oh, wow.
and I would look through it and give them feedback. And so I can say that there are plenty of 17-year-olds, at least during that time, that were confident enough to approach a professional and want to get some feedback. And it was easy to remember what it was like for me to be in their shoes. And
Right,
so um, I made a point to be very encouraging, even if I didn't have a lot of positive feedback for their work. And even if it was obviously not ready for professional consideration, I always wanted to give them uh, something good to walk away with, some advice that they could then like apply to the next thing they did.
yeah.
Because that's a pretty grueling process. I went through it myself when I started pitching, um, where you walk up thinking, I've got everything I need to be part of this business. I'm going to be a pro. All he has to do is look at my work and say, "Great, this is perfect. You're hired." And that never happened. Not one time. Um, there was a point where I finally got to the right publisher at the right time, and they said, "This looks great. Let me consider it, and I'll get back to you." And then it did lead to something. But there's no way do you get hired on the spot.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Nobody is prepared to do that.
right, yeah. I feel like that's like I had that like ambition like like when I was working in like wanting to get into sports. I was like, I'm gonna be the next general manager of like the Celtics or something. Like all I had to do is just get an interview and get in the front office. And I'm like, no, you have to like work from your bottom, like work from the bottom and work hard. And timing is everything too about with that stuff as well. Um,
Yeah.
that's phenomenal though. It's awesome that you were able to like get into the comic book world. What led you into animation and animation director? Like how did you get into that? Like that's on the other side of it now.
Well, the comic book world is what led me there.
Yep.
Um, when I was looking around for more publishing opportunities after I finished with Malibu, I took a comic that I had done in 1992 called Grease Monkey and started showing that around to more publishers.
Yeah.
And one of the publishers I approached was Kitchen Sink Press. They don't exist anymore, but they had started as sort of an underground independent company in the early 80s and or maybe late 70s. And they were looking for comics that they could turn into animated shows. The first one that made that leap for them was called Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, or at least that was the cartoon version. The comic book title was Xenozoic Tales,
Oh, interesting.
and it was this really interesting mixture of like 1930s Art Deco with dinosaurs and Tarzan and all that cool stuff.
That's cool.
It was like a pulp story brought into the 90s as a comic book. Um, and it's really good stuff. The comic book is excellent. If anybody has a chance to pick it up, Xenozoic Tales, it'll blow your mind.
Oh,
Um, and that was a show, or that was an IP that Kitchen Sink pitched around in Hollywood as an animated series, and it was picked up and it was turned into a 13 episode show called Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. And then Kitchen Sink saw Grease Monkey and thought, hey, this has got potential. We could turn this into a cartoon. So let's publish it as a comic book and then get into the pitch process. And so they did that. And by pitching it to various animation studios, that was a chance for me to sort of show my work in a portfolio sense at the same time as we were, trying to offer them a series, because I had done a whole bunch of extra illustrations for the pitch package. They call it a deck now. Back then it was a pitch package. So I had individual illustrations of all the characters and the mecha and the scenery and all that stuff. And we went to every studio in town, and this is the classic Hollywood story. Everybody turned us down until we got to the last studio on the list, which was Universal. And we showed it to exactly the right guy, and he said, "This stuff is really cool. Come on over here and work on my thing." Just like with Dark Horse, right?
yeah,
I think that's probably the most common way you get into an industry.
yeah.
Somebody sees something you've done and they say, "Your thing is cool. Now come over here and work on my thing."
That's
Um, and the thing at Universal at the time was a series they were developing based on a video game called Wing Commander.
oh yeah, I remember that game.
Yeah, it was a Star Wars inspired game with fighters in outer space, and it was one of the first games that had live action cutscenes in it. One of the actors was Mark Hamill,
Oh yeah.
and they wanted to do an animated series based on that, and Mark Hamill was going to be in it.
Oh wow, that's great.
And the representative at Universal saw a lot of the same kind of stuff in my pitch that was going to be in the show. So he hired me to create pitch art for Wing Commander. And then when it got the green light, he hired me to work on the show, to do character designs and storyboards. So that
Wow.
was my very first experience drawing storyboards, and it fit me like a glove. It was exactly the right kind of job for me to do. And the timing was perfect because the bottom was dropping out of the comic book business really quickly.
Oh really?
Yeah, this was 1996. And if you look at your comic book history, not too long before that, there was a big cave in when the main distributor, Diamond,
Yeah.
decided to buy out their competition, the next biggest distributor, which was called Capital City. And by absorbing Capital City, they made it much harder for independent publishers to thrive, because now everybody had to go through one source to get their comics into stores. And as a result of that, orders were slashed pretty significantly on just about everything.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And so I saw this happening, and it was getting harder and harder to find work because publishers were drying up left and right. And so I thought, maybe it's time to do something else.
Yeah.
And so it was the perfect moment for me to pitch a comic book as an animated series, because it got me hired to work on an animated series.
That's so cool. Did you ever was Mark Hamill a part of it? Did you ever like talk to him and have that discussion or any
I didn't meet him during that process because as a voice actor, he would go into a recording studio
yeah.
and he would work with the supervising director or the producer of a show. But as a designer and a storyboard artist, I didn't have any part of that
Ah,
process.
ah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So unfortunately, I didn't meet him there.
Oh, but did you end up meeting him down the line?
I had met him. Um, let's see. It was after Wing Commander. I bumped into him at a comic book store in Santa Monica.
Really?
Yep. He had his own comic book out at the time, and he was in there just behind the counter signing copies. And I went there with a friend of mine who was working in the animation studio with me. And this was a later studio. This was Sony. And we were working on Ghostbusters.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So that would have been probably 97. And so we every Wednesday we went to comic book stores together. And Mark Hamill just happened to be there that day.
That's crazy. That's
There was nobody else around. He was just there signing his own comics. So we chatted with him for a while, and it was fun.
that's awesome. That must have been a
Yeah,
really cool experience for you to meet Luke Skywalker as well too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I could have told him my whole life story because he
Yeah,
was a part of it.
yeah.
But I decided, no, he's probably had that enough. So we just talked casually. I brought up Wing Commander. We shared a couple of stories about that, and it was great. I left feeling like I'd made a friend.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so cool. Also you worked on like a lot of projects too as an animation and as an animation director, mostly
Mhm.
heavily on the DC and Marvel end. How closely for those like animations, did you have to like follow the comic books or did they kind of have their own story? Like how does that work?
They're essentially two different worlds, and they have to be because unless you're specifically adapting a published comic,
Yep.
um, you are kind of in your own continuity. Think of it as part of the multiverse,
Okay.
where you function independently, and it has to be that way because if a TV show crew has to check in with a comic book crew or vice versa to make sure they're all in sync, um, that's an obstacle to production that nobody needs. And so most of the comic-based cartoons that I've worked on have looked at comics for inspiration, but have never depended on comics to give them what they needed. Um, so they would have their own continuity. They would have their own story arcs. Sometimes they would be similar to what you saw in comics. Like with the Avengers cartoon I worked on for several years, we would grab a major title from a comic arc like Civil War or Secret Wars or Ultron, Age of Ultron or whatever. And we would use that title, but it wouldn't specifically be adapted from the comics.
Oh,
Um, since I was directing on Marvel cartoons, I made it my job, or made it part of my job, to pick up Marvel comics week after week, just so that I knew what was happening on that side.
yep.
And if there was something in a comic that could help us in a cartoon, we were encouraged to borrow it. Um, for example, there was the Infinity War comic series, which predated the Infinity War movie.
Yep.
And we did our own version of Infinity War,
Oh, that's cool.
where we had Thanos tracking down all of the stones and putting them into the gauntlet. Um, and so occasionally we would have to show an alien race or a spaceship, or we would have to do something with a character for the first time. Like like Thanos's elite enforcer group, for example.
Right.
Uh, and if we had to design one of those characters on the fly, I made sure to have comic book reference close at hand so we could fall back on that, and it would make our job easier.
Oh, nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. So there are plenty of times where having comics around influenced us for sure,
Yep.
but there was never a point where we were required to do something exactly the way it had been done in a comic.
That's really cool.
Mhm.
What how did how did you become an animation director and then what like can you describe what an animation director does for those for like people like myself don't like I think I have an idea but also like the details about it as well I guess behind
Sure,
the scenes for
sure.
people to know.
The typical way you break into animation for TV is in the storyboard area. And
Yeah.
I'm just talking for, from the basis of being an artist. The entry level is called storyboard revisionist. And there are two levels above that. There's a storyboard artist, and then there's a director. When you draw a storyboard as an artist, you show it to a director, you get their input, and then you revise it. And if you're in a very busy production period, you will turn those over to what we call a revisionist. And so a revisionist doesn't need to know everything about how to draw a storyboard. They don't necessarily need to know filmmaking techniques, because they're sort of a journeyman, they're sort of a beginner. And so if you can draw comics, you can probably revise a storyboard because you're being asked to pose characters and you're being given specific direction. Okay. After you've done that for a while, you can move up the ladder and become a storyboard artist. And a storyboard artist's job is to take a script from a director and get a whole bunch of input from them and draw the scenes exactly the way you do in a comic, except it's in a different format and you've got to draw a lot more because you're not just drawing a still that links to another still, you're drawing poses that stretch out over a scene.
Yeah.
You don't have to draw every pose, but you have to draw enough so that it's going to be understood what's happening. If a character is running from one point to another, you got to show where they start, where they stop, maybe one in the middle. And then when you finish your storyboard, you turn it back over to your director and get input. Now that takes us to the next level up, which is director. Director is essentially in charge of an episode.
Yeah.
It's their responsibility to get that episode from script form all the way to a finished storyboard that can be turned over to animators. And the way I used to describe it was, think about what a live action director does. They determine what needs to be in a shot. They decide where the lighting is. They decide what the emphasis should be, how the actors are delivering information. And they also have to know what came in the shot just before, what's going to come in the shot after, so it all connects, right? There is a little more to it than that. I could tell you that I would do exactly what a live action director does, except I draw it instead of getting other people to do it for me.
Right. Right.
But then I'm asked, what's the difference between a director and a storyboard artist? Well, a director, as a director, the first thing I usually do when I'm given a script is I rewrite it.
Oh, okay.
Because animation writers know a lot about animation, but they don't know specifically some of the limitations that we have on a show.
Yeah.
For example, they may not know how many characters we can put in a shot before we max out. They may not know exactly what a set looks like if they haven't seen the design. They may not know how things have evolved over a few episodes. Like in the beginning of the show, you think like a set is going to be created, arranged one way, but then over time it evolves into something else. And so that's all information that I have to have in my head when I get a script, because when I rewrite it, I'm filling it up with all the information that the writer doesn't have.
Yeah.
I also make decisions about pacing. Like if a character has a long line of dialogue to deliver, I know that if you're just looking at that character and they're speaking that line end to end, it's going to be pretty boring because there's not much happening.
Yeah.
And so I can figure out, all right, well, you could start delivering this line and then we'll cut to something else and continue it with voiceover. Or since he's referring to this thing, we should cut to that thing so we can see what he's referring to. And so I'll put in some filmmaking direction. And there are just a million little details like that that makes it easier for a storyboard artist to do their job.
Yeah.
And then there are times when I'll read a script and I'll see a scene exactly the way I want it to play out in my head. And so I'll sketch that for a storyboard artist. I'll give them like a key pose, or I'll show them exactly what a scene should look like for maximum impact, and then they'll construct that scene for me. And then 9 times out of 10, when I get a storyboard back from them, I'll redraw some of it because it doesn't quite come up to the show that I see in my head.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to do as a director.
Yeah,
Uh,
that sounds like a lot.
yeah, but I love it because it's like the next step above making a comic book.
Right.
And you've got a whole team there to help you out. And
Nice.
so uh, it sort of pays off the image you have in your head when you first read a comic, because you become an active participant. You are essentially filling in the missing bits between panels. You know, if an artist, if a comic book artist does their work really well, they make it easy for you to do that.
Yeah.
Um, so you can work out what happens between panel 1 and panel 2. And then when you make a cartoon, you actually get to draw that.
That's cool.
And so it takes all of that imaginative energy that comics put into you, and it gives you a chance to lay it all out in pictures.
That's awesome.
And yeah, when you get to the end of that process, you've essentially made a movie. And it's so much fun to see it all come together.
Yeah, that's gonna be really cool. I want to know, like, some episodes are on like like some episodes for like cartoons usually run between like that 23 minute, 25-minute range. How long does it
Mhm.
take for you to actually make one episode of a show? Like, well, how long will that actually take?
In terms of storyboarding, you can do it in 4 weeks.
Oh, wow.
That's about the quickest turnaround I've seen, and that's what it was like on Marvel shows. They didn't have big budgets,
Yeah.
and so we got a new script. As a director, you got a new script every 4 weeks, and you already had shows in production, so that that load keeps getting heavier and heavier and heavier.
Yeah.
As you ramp into a series, you're getting more and more scripts while other scripts are still in production. And there's a point where you hit your peak, and then you're finishing shows as you're getting new shows, right?
Wow.
And at my peak on an Avengers show, I would have 5 episodes, all in different stages at any given time.
Wow.
So that's another part of being a director. You've got to learn how to juggle,
Yeah, that's crazy.
because you might work on different pieces of 5 different shows over a single workday.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That's
So
that's
you've got
gotta
to
be a
pull
lot.
your head out of one show. Like maybe I'm writing or rewriting a script in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'm jumping into another show that's been storyboarded already, and I'm revising that. And then toward the end of the day, I might jump into another show that's still in the design phase, and I'm working out, what designs should look like. So I've often called it like you're a train conductor and you've got 5 trains on different tracks at all times. Or no, you've got 5 trains on a single track,
Yeah, yeah.
and you've got to get one train finished and shunted off so that the next one can come up and take its place.
Oh my God. That's a lot of
Yeah,
balance and a lot of like focus and the like kind of go into a different mindset, I guess, for like other
that's
shows.
right. That's right.
That's
That's right.
crazy. That's crazy.
Uh, that's about as intense as it has ever gotten. In other shows I've worked on, you get 6 weeks to do a storyboard, sometimes 8 weeks. Um, Recently, well, last year on Netflix, they put out Arcane. You
Yep.
probably saw that, the streaming
Yep.
series. And I was kind of amazed to learn that they had been given much longer
Oh wow.
than 8 weeks to storyboard that show, and it really shows. I mean, you can see an incredible complexity of work that went into that series.
Yeah.
It's feature film level, and you just don't have time to do work like that in a 4 week cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I envy them on one hand that they got all that time, and I'm sure the Spider-Verse movies are the same way. You cannot make something like that on a TV schedule. On the other hand, what I like about TV episodes is they go pretty quickly. They come in, they go out, and then you get another one. And so you're not stuck on one episode for an extended period of time where it's constantly being revised over and over and over and over and over. After a while, you would lose or at least I think I would lose my passion for it, because if I'm now revising a scene for the 10th or 11th time, it's beginning to blur together and it's not special anymore. I just want to get rid of it.
Yeah. That would make sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I have yet to work on a feature film.
Oh,
And at some point, maybe I will. But the idea of spending an entire year storyboarding it is not attractive to me.
as you say, that's a long time.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
a really long time to focus on one thing.
yeah.
And if your heart's not in it, that's got to be really tough.
Yeah, I was gonna say that won't come out as well as you want it to be if your heart's not in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You had brought it up before, but I was wondering, could you tell us about your comic book Grease Monkey? I would like to, I saw it and I think you have a copy with you. I was just kind of curious. Could you tell us about it?
Yes. Here is Grease Monkey, the graphic novel.
I love it.
And it's a hardcover, which is pretty cool. It's my first hardcover. And it's got a long history behind it. If you go to my website, again, timeldred.com, you'll see an entire channel dedicated to Grease Monkey, because it has its own website. And it gives you all the comics I've ever done, plus a couple of short animated films. And it tells you the whole history of the project, which I think is kind of an interesting thing to look at. I don't know if any other comics have gone through a history like mine, but it went through multiple different publishers before it got into this format.
Really?
The first publisher to pick it up was a Canadian distribution company. They put it in their monthly catalog for 6 months, and that allowed me to sort of build the foundation for it. After that, it went to Kitchen Sink. I already told that story. After that, it went to Image, of all companies.
Yeah.
And then eventually, when the rights all came back to me, I decided to bump it up a level, because I had filled it out into a big, long graphic novel at that point. And I thought, well, maybe I could go outside the comics world into the actual publishing world. And so I got myself an agent, and he pitched it to a science fiction publisher called Tor. And they thought it was really interesting. And so they picked it up and they put it out in this format.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And it came out in, I think, 2004. Yeah, that's right. This edition came out in 2004, and it won a couple of awards. And since then, they sort of dropped out, because publishing is even more cutthroat in that world than it is in the comics world.
Really?
But I just kept on going. I did a whole second graphic novel, and I've got two more in my head that I'll get to eventually.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I didn't say anything about the story yet, but I wrote it as sort of a commentary on the comics I was seeing in the 90s, which were getting increasingly angrier and narrower. Superhero comics were at the top of the heap, and they were getting more and more self-referential, more and more samey. You would look at one, it would look just like another one, no matter who published it. The audience was getting smaller and smaller, because they weren't really doing the work of trying to bring in new readers. And I thought, number one, this is no fun. Number two, it doesn't give us a future. And so I thought somebody should be making comics that are fun and that can attract more than just a superhero audience. And so Grease Monkey was what I came up with.
That's awesome.
It's a science fiction comedy. And the best way I can describe it in a nutshell is Planet of the Apes meets Battlestar Galactica.
That's a good way.
Grease Monkey, of course, is a term for a mechanic.
Yep.
And in my case, the chief mechanic is this gorilla character, and he works on a spaceship and he repairs fighter planes.
That's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. And uh, it gave me a chance to tell real world stories, because that's a pretty down to earth job,
Yeah.
fixing things. And even though it's got a science fiction backdrop, the characters are very relatable. They're very grounded. They're very real life. And gorillas are my favorite animals. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to team up humans and gorillas in sort of this pressure cooker and see how they respond to each other? And there's a whole backstory about why gorillas are now intelligent enough to work on spaceships. And so that's all waiting to be discovered if you choose to dip into the grease monkey world.
Yeah, that looks awesome. I'll have to definitely check it out. I read it. I read some like I read about it online and everything. I thought that was like a really cool concept that you had, and
Mhm.
definitely have to check it out for sure. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll definitely look at it. But Tim, we got two more. I got a couple more questions for you, and then we'll wrap it up. One question is, wanted to tell you about what we're doing here at Anime Village, and just kind of want to get your thoughts on it for someone who's been in the animation world, comic book world, who's read Japanese comics. Here at Anime Village, we're creating our own mangas, our own original mangas. So behind me is the title of our manga that we're working on now, and the first chapter is actually out on our website, and it's called Adamanto,
Mhm.
and that is an adventure. It's about a guy named Sneechitano, who has the Nexus Adamanto, which is gauntlets that can fire power, and it has a lot of like mixture of Japanese and Greek history in there, and it's like a really good story. I'll send it to you after, and then obviously you and Brian connected on LinkedIn. Maybe you guys can connect too on
Yeah.
that.
Well, in preparation for this conversation, I took a walk through your website, and so I saw it, and I see that what you're planning over the long term is a multimedia environment
Yep.
that allows users to come in and interact with your content on different levels.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So you've got a comic book, well, a web comic.
Yep.
I'd like to talk more about web comics because that's near and dear to my heart. And
Yeah.
then you want to build that up into a gaming environment as well, and then ultimately take it to other media, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Animation.
Yeah, yeah, animation down the line.
Yeah. I really admire your enthusiasm for this and your ambition. I think it's a fantastic idea, and I wish you all the success in the world.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We really
But I have a question.
talk to me.
Why are you choosing to call it manga instead of comics?
I think it's more the hit. I think that's more of a question for Brian, but I think that's like heavy what we are doing is the mangas because it's where well, a lot of us are anime fans and um I think that's like one of the reasons, but I think Brian would be one that could actually answer that question as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then hopefully at some point I'll have a conversation with Brian.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
and if
Yeah.
we come back and maybe do another episode, that'd be great.
Yeah, yeah.
The
I
reason I
would
bring it up is, well, the reason I bring it up is because in my mind there is a very specific difference between comics and manga. And I think it's important for communication purposes to outline what those differences are, and uh, and look at the reason that we have these two different words. Manga to me has always represented comics made by Japanese artists for primarily a Japanese audience. That's their initial market. And then if those comics gain international attention, great, that's great for them. The rest of the world doesn't use that word. Manga is a word that is rooted in Japan, came from Japan specifically uh, to create a category of Japanese products. But in Europe, in England, uh, in America, in South America, in Canada, we have the word comics.
yeah.
Uh, that word existed first. It has a longer history. I don't think there's anything wrong with that word. I still choose to use it myself to describe what I make. And so um, to me, I bump a little bit on the use of the word manga when it's being used to describe something not made in Japan.
Interesting.
And I have the same bump when I consider the words anime and cartoons. I know that there may be some marketing impetus behind it, because you definitely want to appeal to fans who like manga and anime. Those are fantastic bodies of work, and there's no problem at all in using them as inspiration. I would just want to carefully consider what terms get used in marketing, just so that there's no misunderstanding about what you're creating.
Understandable. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to use the word manga, I would just find different ways of using it. You are creating webcomics. Webcomics are a perfectly honorable medium. So a webcomic drawn in manga style would be a perfectly good descriptor for what you're doing. A cartoon drawn anime style would be a perfectly good descriptor.
Yeah.
So if I were on the board and offering my advice as a counselor, I would suggest some consideration in that area.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Well, I have to get you and Brian together because I think you guys would have a very interesting, a great conversation. I think that should be a podcast that we do, all three of us together. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about webcomics,
Yeah.
because it's something that I think represents the future in a way that few people understand. To gain a solid understanding of what makes them special, you have to know something about comic book publishing and book publishing in general, and that is what I call the tyranny of paper. If you've ever been involved in a publishing project where something was going to go to paper, you've experienced this tyranny firsthand, and that is a chain of expenses that weigh you down. So I'll explain it to you the same way I've written about it at my website and described it elsewhere. Paper is a physical object. If you intend to put something on paper, first thing you have to do is buy the paper. Then you have to buy the ink that'll go onto the paper. Then you have to pay somebody to print that ink on the paper.
Right.
Then you have to pay somebody to bind that paper up. Then you have to pay somebody to box it up and store it and ship it. And then you have to hand it over to a retailer, and then you will get only half of that money back. Half of the cover price is all that you're going to get back. And out of that half, you have to pay off everybody who handled that paper.
Yeah.
And so the moment you commit to putting something on paper, you take on this whole chain of expenses and responsibilities. And what that means on the creative side is that whatever content goes on that paper has to be guaranteed to make a profit.
Right.
And this is why so many things never get that far, because a publisher or an editor will look at it and say, I can't guarantee that this is going to pay for itself, so we're not going to do it. And so the way you short circuit that process is you do a complete end run around the paper and you put it directly online. And I did that myself when I created the Grease Monkey website.
Yeah.
I drew the whole first graphic novel for paper. Then I drew the whole second graphic novel for paper, but I never found a publisher for it. So I just put it online for free. Anybody can read it anytime they want to.
That's awesome.
And I had the pleasure of drawing it. I enjoyed every minute of that process. And now it doesn't matter that it doesn't pay for itself, because I didn't have to put it on paper.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's online. Anybody can go and look at it. If it leads to something else that makes me money later, terrific. But the real point of making this stuff is the joy of creating it, right?
Yeah.
Every step that takes place between creating it and selling it is just a headache. And so if you can jump right from creating it to sharing it with somebody, you're going to have a much better time. And so after this experience, I decided I'm just going to make webcomics from now on. I'm not going to bother with paper. I'm not going to fight against an editor or publisher to convince them that what I have is going to sell. Maybe they're right and it won't sell, but I still want to make it, right?
Right.
So I'm just going to do that. And then I'm going to put it online and I'll pay my bills in some other way. And so since then, I've been just doing webcomics. I did some Star Blazers webcomics for my Star Blazers website. That's an anime series, in case you didn't know.
Oh, no.
And I did my first original, all just a specific webcomic called Pittsburgh, which you can find through my archival site from timeldred.com. That was the first project that was done specifically for the web. And knowing that it would never, ever go to paper, I decided to experiment with it. Have you ever heard a term called infinite canvas?
No, I haven't.
Well, an infinite canvas is what you have on a website. There is literally no limit to how many square inches you've got to show something. If you keep adding pictures, that website will keep scrolling.
Oh,
You could add as many pictures as you want. That's why they call it infinite canvas.
that makes sense.
And so with Pittsburgh, I thought, I'm going to see what infinite canvas can really do. I'm going to see how it affects the kind of story I can tell. And man, was that fun. It was like suddenly all the frames are exploded. It was like having no limit at all. I did one chapter with a panel that if it were printed on paper would be 4 feet long.
Wow. Holy crap.
Yeah,
That's
and
awesome.
the whole point is to just scroll through this panel and see it unfold before you. I also found ways to kind of imitate storyboarding, where you see a move and then another move and then another move and another move.
Yeah.
Um, and there's also a soundtrack that goes with it. And some of the comics are vertical, some of them are horizontal. And it just it brought me so much freedom, and I was discovering something new to do almost every day. It makes me never ever want to go back to paper.
Oh, really? Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun. Like, yeah, it sounds like a lot of freedom to kind of like use your creativity and do what you want.
Exactly. And if you've been listening to me over the last hour, that's what it's always been about.
Yeah, I love it, Tim. Tim, you got some awesome, like such a cool and amazing background. I gotta check out all your stuff. I saw some of it and I gotta check it all out because I didn't know you had all these websites and everything. So I'm gonna be a busy man this weekend checking out everything that you have done.
Good, good. And I
Yeah.
hope it gives you some inspiration for your projects too.
Yeah, thank you. I really
That's really the whole reason. Well, that's the secondary reason for doing my website, which I call Art Vault.
yeah.
Uh, Main reason I put it out was so I can just get all the stuff out of my archives and into the sunlight. But the second thing I wanted to do was just share this creative passion and show people all the different ways you can exercise it in different channels and different media, and I hope it inspires many many more people to do what I do.
Yeah, I hope so too, because it's phenomenal and I love it. I love it, man. This has been such a great interview. It's been so awesome to get to know you too. And like it's crazy. It's funny to meet someone that's worked on cartoons that I've loved growing up as a kid. And now I gotta look into all your other work because as I get into other things, I'm like into more comic books and starting to, nerd out a lot more.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Tim. Well, thank you for your time today.
All right, good luck.
Thanks.